Good afternoon. My name is Wayne Beaton. I am the Director of Open Source Projects at the Eclipse Foundation. I regard my role as I'm here to help make our open source projects and our committers successful. I have a team at the Eclipse Foundation that we collectively refer to as the EMO, the Eclipse Management Organization. Maria Teresa here most likely has read your emails. I have likely read them at one point or another in the past as well. We also have on our staff, we have an intellectual property team. We have some trademarks expertise. Actually Boris is here as well. Boris is on the team. Where's Boris? There's Boris right there. Boris is also helping in various ways, actually. But anyway, today I want to talk a little bit about how we've updated our intellectual property due diligence process. Trademark disclaimer, the Eclipse Foundation logo are all trademarks of the Eclipse Foundation. All right. Okay, background. So back when we started this whole Eclipse experiment, more than 20 years ago. The Eclipse Foundation is almost 20 years old at this point. Our focus was on very, very deep intellectual property due diligence. We did provenance checking of every single thing, which meant digging in line by line into code to ensure that we understood who wrote every little piece of everything. And that we understood absolutely every aspect of the content. Our existing tools and infrastructure, today were created, again, sometimes I think at least 16 years ago, we created IPzilla, which we've inflicted on many of you. Who's had IPzilla inflicted on them? Okay, good. I apologize. So IPzilla is based on Bugzilla. It's somewhat tuned. There's a couple of really neat features in it. It served us well for some period of time, but it's basically ancient at this point, and certainly clumsy and clunky by the standards of the software available today. The Eclipse Foundation was conceived as a single license foundation. So everything we did initially was the Eclipse public license, then the 1.0, and now at some point the EPL became the EPL 2.0. But the idea was that every project was under that license, which made doing license checking, provenance checking, license checking anyway of third-party content and stuff relatively easy. Because everything was about compatibility with one particular license. That's mostly true. The industry has kind of changed. People really stopped caring about the deep due diligence. Really what the industry cares about today and what everybody that cares about is really license and just sort of some general sense of copyright checking. So the idea is, again, we changed our process a number of years ago to focus just on license compliance. For a little while, we had this notion of Type A and Type B the due diligence, which I'm sure was as painful for you as it was for us. But that was allowed. At one point we allowed project teams to decide to do a deeper level of due diligence or not. Again, as industry has changed, license compliance is what we care about. We also care about security, different topic, but very related, it turns out. A lot of the work that we've been doing regarding license provenance applies pretty well to this, or at least contributes to the security story too. Mikhail Barbero, our new head of security at the Eclipse Foundation, and I are working very closely on this kind of thing. SBOMs are becoming an expectation in the industry, software bill of materials. We've always done something like this. Eclipse plugins have an about file which describes the licenses and copyright of the content that's in the plugin, for example. We evolved to a point where some of the projects that don't do Eclipse plugins have notice files that describe, again, the content that they reference. And then things like even just the Git log itself is actually a part of the SBOM story. Now these are not standard SBOM formats. I'll talk a little bit about SPDX and I'll mention Cyclone DX. There's some standards that are evolving in this space that are machine consumable and very standard, which are good. Automation is really our only way of surviving. We've been tinkering with automation. I don't think it should surprise too many people. Our IPzilla has done some automation for years. We call Genie, the process Genie, that does some review behind the scenes. But still, a lot of what we were doing is very manual, and certainly very manual for committers. We were making you create CQs. So our IP policy update, the EPL is no longer special. This has actually been true for a long time. We've just made it official. We have a lot of projects that are under Apache license or MIT or other licenses. The IP policy was built, though, around projects all use EPL. And again, just not true, and it wound up making the IP policy very specific on certain topics that we were able to generalize. We're focusing our energies entirely on license compliance. Now, what this means is it's not so much about whether licenses are on an approved list or not on an approved list. It's more, are licenses of the content just compatible with one another? If my project code is referencing some third-party content, does the project's license and the third-party content license, do they actually work together? That's really the only thing we care about. Previously, we had to go to the board of directors to get approval. Of all the painful things that we've had to do, this is, from my perspective, one of the more painful things, is if a project wanted to use LGPL content, I needed to get the board of directors to approve that. Okay, so based on the wide eyes, you probably didn't know that and are startled by it. Anyway, again, the focus now is on license compliance, and if we don't need to go to the board to get approval for licenses, as long as they are compatible, as long as we can demonstrate that they are compatible. Hard problem in the general case. Compatibility of licenses, hard problem. And the easy cases are easy, and I'll talk a little bit about this later. The hard cases are still hard. One of the implications of this is we used to be able to say, if you're using content from another Eclipse project, that's okay, don't worry about it. Those other Eclipse projects might be under licenses that are not necessarily compatible with your project license, right? So this ability to just use Eclipse content in your project may not be necessarily true anymore. Again, so things got a little bit better, and then some things got a little bit worse. But ultimately, it comes down to, does this combination of licenses actually work together? I should probably note, and actually I surprised people by saying this at one point, is we don't make legal proclamations. So we don't say, when we say this license is okay with that license, that is not legal advice, right? Ultimately, what we're doing is we're doing our best to identify the licenses and make our best estimation, and we actually do have some legal resources that we use in some cases when we need to. But I'm not your lawyer. If you are an organization that's adopting open source software, we are trying to give you a leg up in your IP due diligence process, but ultimately the organizations that are consuming our content and including it in their products, they are the ones that are assuming the legal risk associated with doing that. And they are the ones who are ultimately responsible for deciding whether license A and license B work together, right? Again, we generally think, we have our process and we make what we think is are true statements, but again, not legal advice. Consumers assume the risk. Okay. Okay, no one's bolting for the doors. We're eliminating the manual record-keeping requirements. We used to have this notion of IP logs. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Revoke the existing policy for third-party dependencies, which means if you know what a works with is and you spend a lot of time discovering what a exempt prereq is, I'm sorry, you're just going to have to purge that knowledge from your brain. Again, we don't care. What we care about is license compatibility. We're We've deprecated IPzilla. I announced the deprecation. We're doing this very quickly. Announced the deprecation the end of last quarter, September 30th, I believe. And we are going to retire it before we take our break for Christmas. In its place, we have something called IP Lab. And again, I'll talk about IP Lab in a minute. We eliminate the requirement for IP logs. We're going to rely entirely on SBOMs and the Git logs themselves. I think I mentioned that already. And we're going to implement some build time compliance tools. So we're looking at something, again, I'll talk a little bit more about this in some detail. We're looking at this thing called OSS Review Toolkit, or ORT. And what it does is it's just constantly scanning your repositories, figuring out what the content is in there. It looks at your third-party dependencies. It goes and finds a source for those. Like, it's a pretty cool product. I say product, it's an open source project. Unfortunately, it's not perfect. No form of automation is, so we still very much depend on committers telling us when things are different. Like if you've got some random bit of JavaScript that you've stuck into some random directory somewhere, if it's got license information on it, we'll probably find it and sort it out. But if there's, if there's something that's funky that maybe we don't necessarily, I won't be able to automatically discover, we're going to really count on committers to help us with those. But we're really, at this point, we've had a great deal of success in terms of using some of this automation. We've actually got ORT running and generating SBOMs and doing, generating reports of intellectual property, the state of projects. It's all very cool. We're not quite ready to go public with it yet, but the initial results have been very, very promising. Happy to talk about that with more detail later. So again, we're trying to bring our policy and processes in line with industry expectations. We're trying to improve our ability to scale. Part of this is making the easy things easy. Part of this is, involving committers only when we actually need to involve committers in the IP process. And again, just making it so that everybody, again, we're able to focus our resources on the things that we need to focus our resources on. We're hopeful that this, this is already happening, so we know that this is true. We are reducing the burden on committers for intellectual property due diligence. At the same time, we are reducing the burden on our own staff, which is great for everybody. We're getting rid of the old infrastructure, and we are doing our best to make sure that we automate all the things. So what does this mean? Practical impact. So IPzilla, and who's never used IPzilla? You lucky few. Sorry, Denis been maintaining it, and sorry, Denis, no offense. Okay, it's all right. Okay. No, thank you for IPzilla. It was lovely. We're moving on. So what we've got now is IP Lab. IP Lab is an instance it's a repository on our GitLab instance, and it's completely stock. We don't use there's no customizations in it. It's a pretty straightforward interface. It has a lot of the wonderful bells and whistles you've all come to expect from GitLab. And again, it takes the form, again, of what we call IP Lab, Intellectual Property Due Diligence Repository. This is where what it looks like. We've provided a lot. We'll be updating all of our documentation to provide pointers to put you in the right place. I'm not going to show you a pointer right now because it will be so easy to find, you won't believe it. What's that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've got such a track record of that. Anyway. So one of the other things that we're doing, and this is more interesting for new projects or projects that are maybe moving existing repositories into Eclipse Foundation management. In the past, we required that you create a CQ, attach code to your CQ. We would do a cursory IP check. Our IP team would engage. They would tell you it's okay to check in. At that point, you could go and work with the IT team to move your repository or create a new repository, or whatever you wanted to do to get a repository under the Eclipse Foundation's management. In parallel, then you could start working. In parallel, we would do a deeper dive on your content, and eventually, some number of weeks or months later, we would say everything's cool, you're approved. We're changing this slightly. Once the project is created and we've initiated the provisioning process, we will move your repositories over into Eclipse Foundation managed resources whenever the team is ready. And we will just initiate the IP review from those repositories. So this is again, if you've never, this is the people who've already experienced this don't get any benefit from this, and the people who do get the benefit from this never experience the alternative. But anyway, just putting it out there that it's there. The same thing, it's still true though that all of this has to be done before you can release. And we have this notion of release reviews, release records. If you create release records, those help us prioritize when we complete reviews or how we prioritize the completion of reviews. Just managing expectations, the amount of time that it takes to complete all of this is probably going to be about the same. The difference is in perception. You can just keep moving rather than this perception that you have to wait for these approvals. One of the shortcomings we've discovered on this is we did this repository move thing very quickly for a project recently, and it turns out that we hadn't actually gotten all of the necessary agreements from all of the committers to give them permission to use the repositories after we'd moved them. So timing that is something we're going to be paying attention to. We're going to make sure that new project teams are aware of the fact that once repositories are part of the Eclipse project under management of the Eclipse Foundation, only the committers who have signed the necessary agreements are able to act as committers on those projects. So again, that's just more of a timing thing, and we'll make sure we coordinate that in the future. We were just shocked, because this takes a little while, and then it happened almost instantaneously, and yeah, there was some surprises. We do try to learn from our mistakes. Anyway, so project code contributions, IP Lab, basically provide a title, you talk about specific, there's documentation that talks about the specifics of what this looks like. Identify the project, we have a template for this and everything. Identify the project, and identify whatever information we can provide for that contribution, including a pointer. In this case, I'm providing a pointer to a pull request. And it's the source. So basically, we have a processor that knows to go and find this source and scan it and give us a report for it. The IP team then takes a look at it, and if they have any feedback, they'll provide it. The scanner looks for license information in the content. So again, we're still creating a record, requesting a review. This particular example is for project code contributions. Example here is a pull request. According to our IP policy, any pull request that's more than 1,000 lines of code, we would want you to engage with us to review it to make sure that it's clear from a licensing point of view. And I guess there were provenance issues. With project code, we do look at provenance as well. So anyway, so we would look at this. This is one of those relatively rare things that project committers need to do sometimes. Again, when you get really large contributions, if you get a contribution and you're not sure about it, maybe you're not sure if the people who wrote it, say wrote it, are actually the people who wrote it. You're maybe worried that someone may have liberated the code from some other source. You would do this to engage with us too, and we would help you sort out those kinds of things. All right. IP logs are replaced by the git commit record, notice file, and SBOMs. Again, as I mentioned, we do have SBOMs in different formats today, but we are working towards SPDX and Cyclone DX are the two standards we're looking at right now. We generate those with the ORT tool that I'll talk about a bit in a minute. We're still doing the IP log reviews, basically the equivalent of it. The IP log reviews, this is whenever a project engages in a release review or a progress review with us, we build your code. And then based on what we experience building your code, we see the dependencies and we check those. And yeah, anyway, so yeah, we build your code. If you haven't heard from us, then that means your build probably worked. If your build is funky in some way, this is hard for us to do, and then maybe it makes it more time consuming. I should point out too that all of the automation works great if you can do Like if I could do like for a Maven build, if I can say Maven verify, and it actually works, then I'm going to be very successful in doing automation. If I have to stand on my head to do different things to make your Maven build work, much, much harder for automation, and we're still probably looking at some manual intervention. Unfortunately, automation is not magic. Has anyone actually looked at the Dash license tool? Keep your hand up if you like it. Okay. Oh, that's just cold. You're fired. All right, you got it. It's on. It's recorded. All right, good. So the Dash license tool, with all these changes, actually the process for committers became a little bit harder, right? So it used to be that you had to create a CQ for every little thing you did, every third-party library that you did. And that was pretty handy for us to keep track of what you were doing. And the fact that you had to actually create the CQ was relatively simple. I want to use this third-party library. I have to create this request to use that library. Then it became, you only really need to make a request if we've not already approved the library. Right? So that's a little bit harder. Now you have to do two things. You have to check and see, has this been approved already? And if it's not, I'll have to file for a request for approval. Then we changed the IP policy again, and it allowed us to use services like external services, and we've started leaning heavily on clearly defined. So now you have three things. Has this been cleared by the IP due diligence process? Is this okay according to clearly defined? Are the licenses on the approved list? And is the license score more than 60? Right? There's a lot of things involved in doing that if I wanted to use a third-party library. And then third, if I failed all of those tests, then I'd have to actually create a review record, and then that feeds it back into the system. And then I could do those 3 steps again next time. Because all of that just got too complicated, we started tinkering with writing a tool to do it, and it became the Eclipse Dash license tool. So it basically does everything I just described. It checks our existing records of what we've already approved. It checks clearly defined. And if it doesn't find something in clearly defined, it files an automatic request to review the content. The content gets reviewed. If we approve it, it gets fed back into the system. Next time you run, it works. One of the things we've discovered is there's a lot of computer scientists that don't know what non-deterministic is. When you run this tool twice, sometimes you get different results, right? And the reason why it feels like it's non-deterministic is you're not thinking about all the inputs. So if you ask clearly defined about a particular version, about a particular library, and it comes back and says, I don't know, if you ask again in 5 minutes, it might know. Right, it goes and checks, right? And if you run it, and maybe somebody else has submitted a review request. We may have approved something since the last time you've run it. So the idea is, as you're running this, the data behind it gets better and better and better, and presumably, again, subsequent runs should be better. Now, don't just run it in a tight loop. If you run it every day or so, you should wind up getting better, at least not worse results. Now, sometimes we get worse results, right? Sometimes we discover a problem. So we've gone back and fixed clearly defined information. We've gone back and fixed our own information. So sometimes there's these things that appear to be regressions, and it's just because we got better information.
Wait.
Yes?
Does this actually work today?
Oh, sorry.
Meaning that the Dash tool, the plugin is actually in a public repository?
So the plugin is in our Nexus instance. That's one of the things I need to do, is do a proper release of this and put it on Maven Central so it's easier to get at and use. Yes. The problem is everyone seems to be getting on with it. Like this hasn't been the priority. Like it just seems to be working for everybody. So complain would be maybe a starting point.
Didn't I do that?
You just got it. I got it. It's noted. It's noted. And I'm totally going to remember when I get back to my desk. So I just described kind of what happens already. You throw it to the Dash license tool. It checks our license check service, which goes against our foundation database, which has been accumulated. Basically took all the data that we had in IPzilla and put it into a form that we could actually use. I don't know if you've used IPzilla, you know that there's these like textual descriptions of libraries that aren't really all that helpful for machine matching. So we fairly painful process to get that mapping set up. If it doesn't work there, again, check clearly defined. If that doesn't work, we fire things off to IP Lab. IP Lab either automatically approves something or possibly engages the IP team to do some work. Generally, the scanning service uses something called Scan Code Toolkit, which does a great job, but not a perfect job. There's no such thing as a perfect job when it comes to scanning content for licenses. But we've gotten pretty good at tuning it, and it does a pretty good job. Every once in a while, it finds something that isn't actually there, and we have to deal with that. But again, we get a lot of, I actually don't have stats on this yet, but we get a lot of just automation, just automatically works. And then a handful that we're still processing. And unfortunately, so that goes into our queue. But again, we're focused only on the things that need to be focused on. The easy things happen, the hard things take a little bit more work. And then out of all this whole thing, we actually do spit out a list of dependencies and their corresponding licenses. One of the things that's on my list is to generate something closer to an SBOM, like an SPDX SBOM out of the tool. Except that I'm trying really hard to leverage existing services here and not reinvent new things. We're looking at the OSS Review Toolkit. I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to go fairly quickly through this. Again, I mentioned this. This, basically, we pointed at all of the Eclipse repositories. All of your Eclipse project repositories, and it just grabs one, clones it, walks through it, basically runs some tools on it. So we run the scan on it, so scan code runs on it. Based on the results of that, it does some analysis. Based on that analysis, it builds reports of what it finds. Again, it also will identify the use of third-party content. So if you have a package lock file in there, or a yarn lock file, or a Maven POM file, or things along those lines, it looks at those and says, okay, what are the dependencies that are required to run a build based on that file? And it goes out and finds the sources. It checks the license for all the sources of that, and then finds the dependencies of the dependencies, and it kind of walks the whole chain and comes back with a report saying, here are the problems that we found. Again, our hope is that initially we find lots of problems. We feed the problems, we find solutions to the problems, feed them back into the system, and over time the number of problems it's identifying become fewer and fewer and fewer, to the point where these reports become less uninteresting. Be the ideal, right? If we can get like 80% of the time everything just scans clean, that would be a tremendous result in our mind. At some point, like some number of things do need to be manually looked at. One of the challenges is this works really well for technologies that have package managers. Right? So like I mentioned Maven, I mentioned Yarn, I mentioned NPM.js, Cargo, those kinds of technologies, great. C and C++ stuff, it's a little harder to automate that. It's harder to decide that I need this header file from this random package that you need to install before you can compile. So there's going to be some amount, just by definition, there's going to be some amount of manual work that's going to be required by some projects using certain technologies. Of course, if anybody has solutions to that problem, I would love to talk to you. One of the solutions that we've had is if you just create a file that lists the dependencies. This is the dependency, this is the version. We might be able to do something with that file, but it still requires that you do some manual work. So anyway, currently we're accumulating SBOMs, but it's worth noting that the SBOMs that we're generating are a reflection of what's in the repository, not in any particular product you're generating out of that repository. Right? So these are actually different problems. Right? So I can describe in a repository what all the files in that repository are, what all the licenses of all those files. I can look at the third-party dependencies referenced by the various things in there, and I can list all of that in a massive SBOM. But when you build something, you're building individual artifacts, presumably. Maybe you're building multiple Maven artifacts, or maybe you're building something else. Anyway, this doesn't help us. This automation isn't really helping us with that. There are some solutions. We're talking with the GitBOM folks. We've been trying to involve ourselves in that. GitBOM is kind of a neat thing where they want to tool compilers and assemblers, and assemblers and linkers and all that kind of stuff, so that when you're linking something, it says it has the identity of the things that are being linked, and when you're compiling the things, it has the identity of the files that they come from, right? So the whole idea is that license information is attainable from any particular point in this chain, right? When I build components together, and what they want to do is make it relatively, something you don't tend to think about it. The compiler just does it. It's a really neat idea, but again, out of scope with what we're talking about today. So again, I've mentioned this a couple of times. The easy things are pretty easy. We're automating the easy things. Hard things are still hard, and hard things are time consuming. So like when you create an IP lab record asking us to look at node, that's going to take us a while, unfortunately. That's one we're trying to figure out how to be a little bit more efficient on, because we keep getting new versions of node, and it's kind of killing us. And nobody's going to say no to node, right? Ultimately it's some kind of thing we just need to figure out how to pass, and we need to figure out how to get comfortable with it. So we're working on that particular one. Again, trying to make that turn into an easy thing. We'll see. License compatibility. I've mentioned a little bit of this. Before, basically, I needed board approval for you to use LGPL. Now I have to ask a question: are the licenses compatible? And if we decide that the answer is yes, then you're good to go. License compatibility is what we care about. EPL connecting to LGPL 2.1 or later, we believe that actually is okay. So check mark, and then of course the word probably in brackets, because probably. Can the EPL 2.0 content reference GPL 2.1 content? No. At this point, no. Probably. Depends on what you're doing, right? We have a project that has a bunch of code that assembles a bunch of code. There's no actual linking in there between them. So the license, so when Nero works, Adoptium does this as well. Adoptium is Apache code that builds a bunch of GPL code, but there's no linking between them. So that's okay, right? So that's why there's a probably there. We would try to be helpful. Yes?
So does this probably mean that we still need to ask actively?
So this is what, I'm hoping, so we do an IP check when we do reviews. So we're expecting that we're going to detect this when it happens. If you're not sure, ask. If something feels, so our hope is that we can educate committers enough to know that, if we're accessing MIT or Apache or something permissive, don't worry about it. But yeah, so some of these harder problems, I don't know quite how to do it in a general way, but we're hoping that we can get committers to the point where they get comfortable with at least a few of these license combinations, and hopefully these weird ones are relatively rare.
But for the exact case of the LGPL, this is solved now?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, pretty much.
Solved with finger quotes, right?
What's that? Solved with finger quotes, yes. Yeah, there's all sorts of, so none of this is super simple, right? Anyway, this is actually one that I was talking with Mike over lunch. We have a EPL, which has a secondary license clause, and the MPL, which has a secondary license clause. The EPL, you have to actually invoke it. The MPL, you have to revoke it. And we had one combination where they're invoking it in the EPL and revoking it on the MPL, which actually causes a whole bunch of weirdness. It's not wrong, but it does sort of invalidate the secondary license on the EPL too. Anyway, it was a weird combination that we're still kind of trying to work towards a solution on. But we have these sort of weird corner cases. And again, if anything just seems weird, ask. And chances are we would discover this particular example if it came up. Okay, quick. We're also, we're working with as many organizations as we can, many groups as we can to try and not invent new stuff ourselves and like leverage and work with the good communities that are out there. OSADL has a compatibility matrix that we find pretty interesting, and we're hoping that we can leverage at some point. The idea is, this license is compatible with that license, and that'd be something, maybe a resource we would point committers to. I'm not sure if we can actually do that, but anyway, well, we're sorting out solutions to some of these problems. Other things to think about, just quickly. One of the things that we've discovered is a scan code toolkit thinks that this is a GPL thinks that this is this license text is GPL, or sometimes it thinks EPL is Apache. So there's some license scanning is a relatively hard thing to do. It's a bit of a dark art, and it's generally mostly correct. If you put an SPDX license identifier, which we've been basically asking Eclipse projects to do now for some time, it makes things so much easier, right? This is easy to parse. This, hit and miss. Different versions of software, different scanners come up with different answers. Painful. But again, if you do this, we're looking at...
Do you still want us to include the text, though?
I'm glad you've asked. So yes, at this point, yes. I'm looking at this as an option, right? Do we need a bunch of English words in there? Probably not. I haven't actually ran this up the flagpole yet. I'm not sure if we can get away with this. I'm not sure if I'm missing something important yet. But SPDX has tags that allow us to do a bunch of different things, like be very explicit about who the copyright holders are, be very explicit about what the licenses are. And again, unambiguous, right? Machine parsable, very easily machine parsable. So that's kind of the direction I'm kind of leaning in. This actually leads into something called reuse. I've been using it on the Dash license tool for a while. Reuse basically is a means by which you provide license and copyright information for every single file in your repository. So image files, JSON files, things like that don't allow commenting, a little harder to do headers. Reuse.software. Again, there's a handful of our projects that are already doing this. And again, it just makes it so easy to know what the license, what the authors intend the license to be of all of the content. Right now, when we find like image files in content, we kind of do our best to say they said that the root file, the root directory has a license file that says this, so the chances are the images are probably that. Again, with reuse, we can be very explicit and say this is exactly what everything is. And you can do things like generate at least SPDX BOM files, SBOMs from that as well. I think I'm at the end. Yeah, just an example of sometimes you can't include license information directly in a file. So there's this DEP5, which is based on the Debian work on intellectual property, where you can describe individual files and say who wrote it, what the license is. It does allow star, like real wildcards. I'm not a big fan of the star, but it is in the specs. Yeah, it is in the specs. Yeah, so you can do wildcards, which again,
Yes.
Come on, star PL is fine. PL.
Yeah, so in GitBOM, I mentioned GitBOM. This is something we're looking at too, which is interesting. This is more just we're playing along or trying to participate in the work being done here. Chances are I'll be talking to my friends over at the JDT project about enhancing the compiler to do some work with this. But anyway, this is interesting in that it's generating SBOMs that should be exactly right and doing so automatically. And that's the end. I didn't figure to actually get this far. So I think I'm only a minute over. Oh, I'm a little bit more than a minute over. Success still. All right, I really didn't leave any time for questions, but if I'm not doing something else, I'm usually parked out in front of the registration area. Please do not hesitate to approach me and ask me whatever you want to ask me. I'm happy to talk about all of this stuff as much as possible. Go ahead, you can clap. Thank you.